Okay, so like I said, the stuff you need. I have my water on hand. I have my paintbrushes all set up. I've got my paints right here. They're all like on the palette, and I have something to clean my brushes with. So either the cloth or paper towels or something. So, and I obviously already have my drawing done. Now, if we were doing any other acrylic painting, I would start with doing an underpainting, doing a ground layer, and all of that. But with the illuminated manuscript, you really don't have to do that. So I'm not going to bother. What I'm going to do instead is start right into my painting. So you do want to, like, I'm dipping my brush in water. You can't see that. There's my brush. It's wet. What I'm going to do then is take some of the paint, the acrylic paint, make sure that my brush stays wet, and move it over to the side. It should be smooth. Okay? Then I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it on the canvas. Okay, acrylic paint, you may have to paint in layers to get a solid color. I've kind of done some underpainting already. But if you look, I'm like doing another layer. Now, if you're like, what does it look like if I just put it flat on the canvas? All right, it looks like this. So I like to put a little bit of water into it with the brush. You're trying to get a smooth look. So I keep going over it. You try not to like scrub at it. Otherwise, you're going to see all those brush strokes and it dries pretty quick. So if you look, you can already see how one area is darker. Now I'm going to move to an area that I haven't painted already so you get a good idea. Now I'm going to do one of these scrolling vines. This is a fish, so obviously that's watery, but the scrolling vines are obviously going to be green for me. So what I'm going to do is take this, the yellow ochre that I'm using, and I'm going to mix it with a bit of the green. With acrylics, you don't glaze that much. So watercolors you can paint on top of each other and it makes a new color. With acrylics, you have to mix that color onto the palette because it dries so quickly. And try to make enough of the color you need because once this dries out too, you're done. So again, always keep your brush a little bit wet. Don't let it dry out with acrylics unless you're going for that look. If I was doing solely acrylic painting, there would be a bunch of different techniques I'd teach you, but right now we don't need those. So what I'm doing is I'll put my first layer on. I have a little bit too much paint on this brush, so it's making it difficult to get it on properly. That's where I use my... So I cleaned my brush using my Kleenex to clear it off. My brush is still wet. I can go into this paint and keep adding. So you want to paint it again, if you're going for that flat opaque look, in layers. Okay? But not the same way, like I'm not painting in layers here to give it different colors or different variations. What I'm doing instead is painting in layers so it goes opaque, so it goes not see-through on the canvas. Now, you may ask, well, what happens if there's no water in your brush? Well, then you get something called dry brushing, which is a technique. So if you look here, this is dry brushing. It makes kind of like a rough look. Now that's great if I'm trying to get that texture in. It's something that we actively use, especially if we're doing like trees and landscapes. But if you're doing an illuminated manuscript, dry brushing really wasn't a thing for them. They liked flat, opaque colors because they were usually painting in ink. Ink doesn't work that well. The reason when I'm teaching this in class, I usually use watercolors is because it reacts the same way ink does. So, but acrylics is fun to do too. So if you look, that's me adding that. So then you might be like, well, miss, how do I get shading? I've seen shading in acrylics. Well, that's pretty easy. What you do is you mix the color right on the palette and you use it to shade. So I'm taking that green color that I started with and I'm mixing it with the brown to give it the shadow. And then underneath, I will do the line. Okay, you have to be careful because you don't want to overpower it, but you want to be delicate. So acrylic paint, the shading and the highlights have to go straight on. You have to mix your colors on the palette and then go from there. when I do acrylics and teach it, acrylics are mostly like, they're better used for like landscape paintings or quick paintings. This illuminated manuscript with acrylics is a little bit more difficult. It doesn't really give you the right look that it should, but for the sake of this, we can use it. Now, I'm just doing this because I wanted a color to test to see how it looks as my background color. And for me, I think that looks pretty cool, so I might use that as my background color. I tend to kind of work off the cuff, but if you want to plan it a little bit more, and acrylics you kind of need some planning, then decide what colors are going where right off the bat, sorry, and then that's what you're going to use. Now, for this background area, like where the leaves are, I want to make them pop, so I know that if I use red, they will really stand out because red is the complementary of green. So what I'm going to do is load my brush up with red. I'm not going to use water, and I'm going to gently and very carefully fill in these areas. Now, the good part about acrylic is that if you do make a mistake, it is easier to cover it than it would be with watercolor. You just paint over it in white and then wait for it to dry and then try it again. Now, keep in mind you can't do this multiple times because acrylic paint, when it dries, is plasticky. So if you keep trying to paint plasticky paint on top of itself, it'll eventually like slough off. So that means the color won't stick as well. But the big thing with acrylic is you have to do it right the first time. Like, don't try, like, be very careful when you're working with it. It's not as forgiving as oils or watercolors. It tends to be hard to cover. So like if I were to screw up and paint the red over top of the yellow, then it would be very difficult to color because the red is way brighter than the yellow, and no matter what I do, I'm going to need like 5 or 6 layers to make the yellow look like it's overpowering the red. So this should be the end of this demo. It's pretty easy. Acrylic is faster to work with in the sense that like you can do an underpainting with it, but when I do that, it's because I'm painting like glazes and layers. If you're just going flat painting like I'm doing with this manuscript, you don't need the underpainting because you won't see it. It covers over everything. So that's the basics on how to do an acrylic painting. Remember, acrylic works best on a canvas, wood, anything that has gesso on it. So it has to have this clear color cover, otherwise the acrylic doesn't really look as nice. So watercolor paint also, if you have a canvas, watercolor paint is terrible on a canvas, which is kind of what I was telling you about the art kits, why I was like freaking out. Because watercolor paint on canvas doesn't absorb properly. You need paper for watercolor to absorb. The reason we use acrylic on canvas is because acrylic doesn't need to absorb. It needs a rough surface to hold on to. So those are how and why you use those materials. If you have any questions, I would let me know. If this was my good copy, I would just keep working on it. Very carefully filling in all the areas, mixing my colors on my palette, and then putting them down. That's the important part. With acrylics, it's all mixing on the palette and then putting it down and working quickly, because if I touch this, this is already dry. Yeah, this is dry too. So like it goes very, very quickly. It dries super quick, and if you miss it, you can't really work back into it. It's dry, it's dry. You can either cover it or really just kind of make a new color and lay it on top.